it's the image there. It looks like you're much farther north than I am because that looked snowing cold.
Yeah, that's a live feed here.
Great, great. All right, well, it's 3 after 9, so I'm going to start things up and we'll admit other people as they come in to this conversation. Welcome, everybody, to Coffee with a County Forester. We are in the 9th week of this program. Kathleen Warner from Vermont Woodlands Association and myself kicked this off with Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester. And we've worked our way through, and this week we are hosting Chris Olson, who is the Addison County Forester. And we're going to hear from Chris. We're going to turn it over to him in just a second. I want to ask you all to mute your mics so that we don't have the background noise. You can type questions in the chat box. If our group stays relatively small, we certainly can let you chime in and ask a question. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you do as a county forester, and we'll take questions after that.
Okay. Well, it's really nice to have this organized for me. It's different way for me to interact with people, as I often arrive to their home or property and find myself out in the woods. And so this is a little bit different, but I appreciate the effort and the interest, just because it's a good way to start the day, I think, with a little cup of coffee and some socialization, which some of us might not be experiencing so much. And so I've been county forester for just over 10 years here in Addison County, office in Middlebury. I'm housed with the UVM Extension people, so it's mostly agricultural office mates. Previous to becoming the county forester, I was a self-employed consulting forester, and prior to being self-employed, I was an employee of the Kelfie Woodland Group. Alan Kelfie's a forester down in Dorset, and so I lived in Paulette and the Meadowy Valley and that beautiful part of southern Rutland County and northern Bennington County. If people haven't ever been on Route 30, driving south and haven't come into the Meadowy Valley, you should find your way there sometime, because it is really, really special place. And so I'm praising southern Rutland County, but certainly Addison County is a really rich place to live and grow up and have forest land. We have a little bit of the Taconic Mountains in the south, mostly Champlain Valley, and then also a piece of the Green. And we have water that drains, everything drains ultimately to the Atlantic Ocean, of course, but we have water that drains south out of Vermont or out of Addison County into the Hudson River. We have water that drains south out of the county via the White River and then into the Connecticut River. And we also have water that drains into Lake Champlain that finds its way into the St. Lawrence Seaway and out through that major waterway into the Atlantic Ocean. And I always like to think about that because, it places us sort of, if you do that wherever you are, it places you in the landscape in a way I think that's just sort of interesting to know. A drop of water falling out of the sky up in the Green Mountains will hit, a twig of a branch and split in two, and off they'll go, those two little droplets, and one of them will find its way into the Atlantic Ocean via the Connecticut River, and the other one would find its way into the Atlantic Ocean via the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is a pretty dramatic little split for a droplet of water. but it also is sort of, the message is also that water then will come back to us somehow. And I just like to think about that, because plants, of course, have a need for water, and they also sort of tend to our water in a way. And so our trees, our plants, our forests are um, a really important part of the hydrological world that we live in. And so there's been a lot of effort recently in the agricultural community here in Addison County to attend to the water quality in Lake Champlain. There's a lot of people who are getting on board. It's a really complicated issue, of course, just because of the way we have all evolved and developed systems for agriculture and forestry. And so that's one thing that I like to think about whenever I go out on a property, is to, where does the water go, and how does it find its way, and what's it doing while it's there. And so that's one facet of my communications and interactions with landowners, which is pretty consistent. I try to deliver that message, or just a discussion, really just opening up this discussion about that with almost every interaction I have. Our bodies are made largely up of water, and so it's like an amazing element that we all interact with. And so that said, then we also have sort of finer elements that we interact with. And I know that in Addison County, I always say west of Route 116, or west of that main face of the Green Mountains that you would find yourself looking at if you were in the valley, it's had a long history of human impact. And when I moved from Paulette up here to Middlebury, I live about a mile from Shaw's Supermarket in Middlebury, dead-end dirt road, about a mile from town. Can't see another house from my house. The house was placed in the late 60s in the middle of what was an old worn out heifer pasture. And when I invited another county forester, who now happens to be our commissioner, to my house this time of the year, actually, I think, we had a meeting, and I said, well, why don't you come over earlier? I'll show you my new place, and so you know where I am. And so he came, and we went for a little walk out on my 6 acres, and partway through the walk, he burst my honeymoon bubble of owning a new house by saying, Chris, the dominant plant on your property is buckthorn. And that's aside from the water, which is like something that we all have wherever we live here in Vermont, fortunately. Here in Addison County, we have a really, really robust community of invasive plants. And when our good commissioner said that to me, and he burst my little honeymoon bubble of owning this piece of property for the moment. And I was like, yeah, you're right. There is a lot of invasive plants. And then he said, well, you know what the real problem is? And I was like, oh, you mean the honeysuckle, not the buckthorn? And he said, no. And I was like uncertain what he was referring to. And then he pointed at me, which was sort of dire. And he was indicating not me personally, but us humans. And so that's what I notice on the landscape often in Addison County, is that the human use, I don't want to pick on the agricultural community too much, but the human use of the lands here in the valley is, it's a long, rich history, and it's brought us to where we are, which in some cases there's a lot of invasive plants. Fortunately, they don't fly like some of the invasive insects, but it's a problem that I find is complicating good forestry often here in the valley. It's not, again, not so problematic up in the mountains. So aside from that sort of gloomy picture, the other thing I like about Addison County is the history of forest management, which is goes way back to like much of Vermont. But what I guess what I'm referring to is the industry. So historically, and in my time, there were two major mills in Bristol, the A. Johnson Company and Lathrop's. And those businesses and those families have been here for a long time. And they're really well-established businesses. They own a lot of land in the valley, and have been really good stewards of that land largely, and care about a bunch of things that we all care about. And it's been nice to get to know those two entities and all their employees, and the interactions that they've cultivated. The community that they've cultivated is it's robust and steady, and so it's like a aspect of our New England community, our New England society, which I really appreciate. And I certainly also understand that businesses like that, if you think that your house is complicated, keeping everything in order, plumbing, electrical work, painting, and all of that, imagine having a sawmill that you're trying to take a log that's 36 inches in diameter and turn it into something that you can sell, and all the moving parts. And so again, there's a lot of skill involved, just with the mechanical engineering of a factory, basically, like that. And so I'm glad to be in a county that has that long history, and stability in those organizations to keep going on. Markets change globally, locally. There's weather constraints and all of that. And so those businesses it's impressive that they've been able to maintain their hold on all that they need to maintain. I'll share one other story with you and then stop talking for a minute and maybe let someone else talk. But when I lived in Paulette, and I was working as a consulting forester, there was, as there are in many towns or locales in Vermont, there was a Lane Handset sawmill in town that was, not running every day, but probably, 50 times a year, that mill would start up, and it sawed largely softwood pine down there for local use. And it was run by gentleman Jim Ross, whose father had started it, and his father had actually died while running the mill, had a heart attack while running the mill when Jim was tailing it, and so that's how he became the owner. It found him. He didn't really go looking for it. And there was a sawmill. I saw an ad in the paper little forest products newspaper that I was getting at the time, and this would have been back in the 90s, that said Sawmill for sale, Route 302 in Mosquitoville, which is like Groton, part of little hamlet of Groton, I think, on 302. Whoever out there drives that road might know the mill. It's right on the south side of 302. And it was a total setup. It had a house, 2-bay garage with an apartment over the top, an enclosed structure with, we all know this because they're scattered all over Vermont, a Lane Handset sawmill, a planer, edger. It had a dual-wheel dump truck. It was like all turnkey. You know, I was reading it and I was like, oh my gosh, look at that. It was whole thing. I think it was sat on 6 or 7 acres, and the whole thing was like $88,000, which I did not have. I had student loans that I was paying at. That's really what I had. But I had a job and I looked at it, and I went and talked to my neighbor friend in Paulette, who had inherited his Lane Handset sawmill when his father had the heart attack running it. I said, Jim, look at this incredible, you know, it's like a complete setup, house with 2-bay garage with an apartment over the top, blah, blah, blah. And he looked at it, and in his wise New England taciturn words, he said, Chris, if you don't think you have enough problems in your life and you don't mind fixing broken stuff, this is a really good idea. And I thought, ooh, he just said it was a really good idea. What did he say right before that? And needless to say, I kept that ad on the kitchen counter and looked at it several times and did not even call or anything. But whenever I drive by there, I look at it because it's still active. It's still present. But anyways, that's just a long story about sharing sort of what it means to be in that end of the business. I mean, I think most of the people watching today have forests or love trees and live in a house that's largely made of wood, maybe have some of our beautiful hardwood species as components of their house. And I just want to have like a shout out to the industry, basically the mills that are part of the fabric of our communities, and deal with what Jim described as a pretty tough way to go to work, basically. So I'll stop talking there and just open it up for questions. I can certainly keep on talking if necessary.
All right, Chris, we'll wait and see if anybody types in anything in the chat box or wants to chime in. We'll try and keep it the chat box that keeps it a little organized. But I'll start off. One thing, I live in the Champlain Valley, so we have people from all over on this call. But can you tell us a little bit about, I know we have this special clay plain forest here in the Champlain Valley that's not really found in the rest of Vermont. What makes it special, and is it more difficult to manage? And, is it a threatened habitat because of all the agriculture here?
Yeah, I didn't, when I first came here, I didn't really know, as well as I do now, certainly, what that meant. And, the history, because of course you have to go way back to understand the history of that. If you just think about the clay plain forests, as they're referred to, but just the clay itself. And if you've ever been in Addison County, somewhere where you've found yourself staring at it, which might be along the Otter Creek or the New Haven River, East Creek down in Orwell, which runs out to the south, which is really a lowland river. But if you find yourself in a place, the clay is incredible. Really, it's like in places it is deep, like not 3 feet deep, but like 20 feet of clay. that is exposed, by some brook or river or by some human activity. And I coming from Paulette, the Meadowy Valley, where the soils are not clay, they're really rich, beautiful soils. I was sort of like, wow, look, it was like totally new experience, both just understanding it, the plant communities that would come from that, but also the complications that it brings to the human interaction with the soil conditions and then the forests and the agricultural community and all of that. And the thing that I have come to know and sort of understand is if you think about 5 feet of clay, which you might see again along a brook, or if someone's digging a hole somewhere in Addison County and they have an excavator and they are digging 5 feet of clay, and then know from a geological understanding how that happened. There was quiet water to allow, clay is a sedimentary formation, and so it means that it was formed with exposure to water, the soils were. And so for 5 feet of clay to form on a landscape over a large area, there was quiet water for a really long time. And when I say a really long time, it's like, I don't know what the number would be, but it's a big number. Probably someone else who's listening in might understand it and be able to explain it better than I. But that's just one thing that's sort of interesting. No matter where you live, is to try to get a handle on what I say is like from the bedrock up, and understand how the forests, how the trees, the individuals in your forests, what they have to do to be successful. They can't get up and move. They are where they are. They're wherever the nut falls, that's where they are gonna be, and they can't really choose necessarily, and so they do what they can where they are. And it's just sort of amazing to think about what existed that allowed those deep soils to form with such fine material. And then, over the last 15,000 years after the glacier left, what has happened. And so that's just one thing I always like to bring out in my conversations with landowners, is sort of understanding the bedrock geology and then the soils, so that they can tease out like what might be happening with the plants on their property, which we all know live a long time, but in comparison to the geologic history, the plants are really just a blink of an eye as well. So any questions there, Lisa?
There are. Let's start. I'm going to go in order down that they were submitted. John McNerney would like to know, what do you find most rewarding about being a forester? And if you could make one part of your job go away, what might it be?
Oh, I should look to see who's listening to this.
That's what I was thinking. A little political there.
Yeah, no. I obviously like the woods. And when I say the woods, I learned this also from another forester who's quite wise, is that the woods are different than their forests. Forest sort of implies something of some scientific nature, whereas the woods are something that is sort of more mysterious and perhaps more wild. And so I think that's that's one thing that I really appreciate is the woods, and know that that's something that I always find pleasure being in, even if there's issues that we might have brought upon those woods. Uh, they're just lovely places to spend time, to wake up. I have dogs here at the house, and so in the morning, first thing before I do anything other than like put my boots on, is I wake up and out we go, and we walk the same little loop. It takes, well, it depends on how fast we go, but we could probably do the whole thing in 10 minutes, if we dawdle or find something to look at or listen to. It might be a little bit longer, but it's just so nice to be out at, and again, traveling the same little loop every day just means that I get to sort of watch things change and evolve over the seasons, and it's just a nice time to be outside, to go outside early in the morning.
Great. I'm going to ask you real quick. I've asked this to other county foresters. Do you have a favorite tree? And if so, what might it be?
Oh, yeah. I think that for me, it actually changes, really. And so I like spruce, which is sort of interesting just because I don't really interact with spruce a lot, but I like where it lives, and its longevity. So the fact that it can hold on to the hope of a little more light for decades in the understory, and then if a change occurs and it has more light, it is able to respond, and so it's resilient, and so I really like it, for sure, just for that sort of quality of resilience, which again is sort of maybe a human sort of thing, but plants and animals of all sorts have varied abilities to resist things, and time is one of those things that I'm just impressed by. And so being, the language of a forester would be, they have a lot of shade tolerance, which again is interesting. People describe plants with varying levels of shade tolerance, and that's exactly what it is. It doesn't mean that they don't like light. It just means that they're tolerant of shade. And so the spruce would certainly love to have full sunlight, but they can wait for the opportunity. And then I'll also say, again, asking someone, a forester, what's their favorite tree, it's sort of funny. It sort of is, it's just it so depends. The house that I lived in, Paulette, was an old house built in 1790 something. It was one of the old Robinson family houses, and when I was doing some renovations in the house was built from, it was a beech timber frame with maple joists and oak planks nailed up on the outside of the beech timber frame, and on the interior walls they were also nailed on there. And so in 1790, all that wood was either cut with axe and then whittled out with an adze, and then sawn with some sort of saw. In our case, it looked like they had a saw on a water wheel. There was like saw kerf marks that were up and down, anyways, we did some renovations and popped out one of those oak boards that had a live edge. You could see like the shape of the stump of the tree in the board, where the bark had fallen off. It was all smooth. And when we started cutting up those boards, because I saved them and we were going to make a dining room table out of them. My wife actually made the table, and she said, "Hey, come down and see how old this tree is." And so that house was built in 1790, and that board was 300 years old in 1790. And so in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, an acorn fell out of the sky. And that the result of that acorn falling out of the sky is where we sit down and have dinner every night. And it's sort of cool to think about that long history. So 1492, that acorn, which, they're forming again right now this year on the oak trees. And that life could live on for a long time. And so that sort of connection to our forest and to history through our trees and through just a little acorn, I think is something that gives me lots of hope and certainly pleasure.
I like that. Resilience and hope are what I heard out of all that. That's awesome. It's also like in Sand County Almanac where Leopold talks about sawing through the tree and going through history. It's one of my favorite parts of reading Sand County Almanac. That same kind of thing, thinking about history. All right, got another question from Dave. After buckthorn, we have a lot of prickly ash. Is this also an invasive, or is it okay to let this spread and go?
It's a native plant, and so it might be invasive, but it's not non-native. And the other thing is, it's the fruit. I don't think the fruit on that causes any health issues, whereas the fruit of both buckthorn and honeysuckle, if they're consumed by an animal or by a human, they're diuretic, and so they cause digestive issues. Like the scientific name of buckthorn is Rhamnus cathartica, and so the species name is cathartica, which comes from like being cathartic or catharsis, which is having a bad belly. And so the fruit of a prickly ash, I don't believe causes that same problem. So it's not something that if wildlife eats, they end up sick. It's a native plant. And so the other plants around it have evolved with it. And so, it's prickly. And so it can be sort of a nuisance if it's in the wrong place on your land or landscape, and you are trying to use that for a different purpose. It can be prickly for sure. And so I would say that if it's there, sort of a moment in time, and might outlive, that little patch or group might outlive human memory, but I don't consider it as a invasive pest or problem, really. Again, if I had 5-acre property and 4 of it was dense with prickly ash, that might annoy me too. And so then I would look for goodness of some other sort and try to give the goodness a little bit of help to overtake the prickly ash.
Great, thanks. Paul notes that he lives on 2 acres that has trees over 50% of the land. Is a county forester able to come and give him advice on the best way to manage what he has? And he says a large portion are beech that seem to be dying, so that's where he would specifically be looking for advice. And so as a county forester, what is your role?
Yeah, so I respond to any phone call or inquiry about trees, whether they be in a front yard or, on the side of large forested landscape, on a big property. And so, yes, if any citizen in the state of Vermont has an interest in forests or forestry or trees or plants on their property, you can call your county forester and set up a time for a visit. And it's there's no cost to it. We're all public servants, state employees, and generally have a fair amount of experience with interacting with the public. That's why we chose to become county foresters. We knew that would be a major part of our job, is actually interacting with the public. And so I spend a lot of time on lands in Addison County of all sizes, acreage, spend time with school groups and that sort of thing. And so I'm happy to meet someone. And so it just requires a phone call or an email and a calendar, and we can set something up.
That sounds great. And I put your email in the beginning of the chat box when we started. I can do it again at the end. So reach out to Chris. Rich wants to know, how do you manage your woods to promote old growth characteristics, and what are the benefits of doing so?
So old growth characteristics, I guess, might include a suite of things. One would be old trees. And so in order to get old trees, the process might include not going into them and staying home and just letting them grow rather than going out there and driving around or trampling around or something. But no, seriously, that oak tree that was established in 1492, it found its way, that acorn found its way out of the tree and onto the ground in a place where it had a chance to live that long. And so I think that's one thing, is if you want to establish old growth, I would think about where the soil conditions, and old growth being like really old trees, where the soil conditions would support that sort of forest development. And so if it were ledgy ground, shallow to bedrock, that might be prone to wind throw and not necessarily, in 100 years, not experience some windstorm that would take the trees down. And so if you want to establish old growth on your property, I would look for places that aren't exposed, have good soil conditions, aren't subject to some sort of natural disturbance. And then, the question is, so what does that mean? How do you do that in such a way that you can control what happens in 50 years or 100 years? And certainly, on our landscape here in Vermont, we do have places that have been protected as forever wild. There's parts of the U.S. Forest Service lands that are legislatively protected that way. And so long as our government stays robust, those places will remain forested and not tinkered with directly by humans. And similar language can be developed on private lands, and it would be like selling an easement to the land trust or to the Nature Conservancy if they had an interest in the property.
Great. Dave had a question about inoculating ash trees. He wanted to know if, and I'm going to say this wrong, but imacetin benzoate is the best treatment for ash trees against EAB, and how often does it need to be administered?
I'm not an expert on that. I do know the same chemical name. I've heard that. I think it's commonly used as far as if someone's choosing a chemical to use. I would recommend, and I can help you find a licensed pesticide applicator. And so if you want to, if you are in Vermont and you want to offer that service to someone using chemicals like that, you have to be licensed. You shall be licensed. And so a landowner on their own land can use those sort of chemicals without a license. And so then it's a matter of following the label, basically. And so I can certainly offer, some guidance on the ground. So if someone had an interest in getting more information about using chemicals to control invasive plants, or wanted to understand impacts and that sort of thing, they could certainly contact me and we could have that conversation.
Great. And Ethan put a link in the chat box that goes into EAB treatment issue from vermontcommunityforest.org. So that may help as well. I will note I received an email today that noted that the flight period for EAB is June 1st to September, I think it's 30th. So that's just coming up around the corner, and just be aware of the slow the spread. So we're not really traveling much, which may help slow the spread even more. But EAB is here in Vermont, and we have to be thinking about it. But we also, I've heard, and if you could talk a little bit about, Chris, management, you don't want to take all your ash out of the forest. You want to keep some to keep the diversity. Am I right on that?
That's right. I mean, I think there's been efforts made in other parts of the country where the emerald ash borer has been present for longer than it has been known to be in Vermont. And there's been efforts made, and science has, given us language like phloem reduction. And so that's the tissue of a plant that an emerald ash borer feeds in. And so there were efforts made in the Midwest to reduce the phloem available for that insects population to be present in, thinking that it would reduce the spread of the insect. I think that had mixed results. And so there's no easy way to control or eliminate the choices or the presence of that insect. It's a good flyer. It's can fly on its own a couple miles, and it goes 50 miles an hour down the highway in a load of firewood. And so it can move around itself pretty well, and then does get transported. And so, I think that trying to slow the spread, as the bumper sticker says, by not moving firewood, keeping your firewood usage close to home is the best method. And then if you have a shade tree that you want to protect, then I would contact a company, and I can provide you with some names of people who are licensed pesticide applicators. And I know like Middlebury College has a tree on their green that they've decided, their arborist and the staff there has decided to make an effort to treat it, both because it's on the green and it has some important presence there on the landscape, and also they want to have that experience of doing that. And I think it's good to have people who are willing to try that, willing to go through the process of actually treating an individual.
Great. And a resource for our landowners that are on to learn about the slow the spread documentation and other invasive species is vtinvasive.org. It's a wonderful resource. I just posted a picture about garlic mustard, and people, it's flowering right now in the valley, and so I keep seeing it, and every time I see it, I'm pulling up some plants, and it's an easy one to tackle on your property, I think, if you have a small infestation. So I'm sending people out with a message to do that.
Right.
Harris wants to know, what have you been seeing for timber prices recently in light of the new economy that we find ourselves in? What's going on there?
That's a good question, Harris. I wish I had, more information particular information that I could share with you. And I don't have particular information, so I'd be sort of speculating on what's going on. I mean, it's the timber prices are based upon now sort of global economic health, and so some of the products from every tree that's felled here in Addison County stay in Addison County, but some of them find their way across the county border, certainly into other counties, and then across state boundaries, and then across country boundaries, and then across continental boundaries. And so here we are. I think that there's probably reason for everyone, from the person with the tree on their property to the person who is, selling veneer, maple, plywood, for everyone to be uncertain and cautious about what they're selling or buying. And so this is a moment in time, yet another moment in time where here we all are together, and there's some unknown. And so I've certainly, I know it's often seasonally dependent. And so right now there's not a lot of wood moving. And so what happens as summer progresses, I think we'll have to wait and see. I think that this past winter, things were pretty decent all around, but certainly were impacted by the global health crisis we're all involved in.
When we think about climate change and its effect on our Vermont forest, what are you seeing? What are you thinking? How is the state addressing that issue?
Let's see if I can answer your question wholly. That's again another really complicated issue. I think that there's, the state has made efforts within the current use program to expand categories of enrollment. Don't specifically address global climate change in the law, or perhaps even in the rules around the law, but there are changes that occurred several years ago to allow ecologically significant treatment areas, significant wildlife habitat, to be identified on properties and managed in accordance with those guidelines for those features, that is, significant wildlife habitat and or ecologically significant treatment areas, allows for landowners to add other interests, other desires to their suite of management objectives that aren't really solely about boards and cords. And so I think that's one tangible effort by the state currently to promote wise use of our resources and have some impact on climate change.
Great, thanks. Let me ask you also about kind of what's going on. Spring is here, the valley, we're kind of more awake than even on the other little aspect of Addison County that's over in, Granville. What's going on? What should we be looking for if we're out in the woods to spark our interest and our joy out there?
Yeah, I would spend time right now outside looking at the spring ephemerals. So the non-woody herbaceous plants that are on the forest floor. They do a lot of their business. The spring ephemeral term refers to their ephemeral nature on the landscape. That is, seasonally, they grow, flower, and fruit. Many of these spring ephemerals, herbaceous plants, all before the leaves come out on the foliage that's 80, 90, 100 feet above them. And so it's a great time to be outside exploring the herbaceous plant communities that exist in your forests, getting to know the ferns. There's good books, like field guides to that I could refer you to that would be useful in helping you identify them. And it's like a whole nother little community. It's different than getting to know your sugar maple from your red maple. Knowing the different herbaceous plants can be just fun to know. And if you start digging into their natural history and understand how they express some attribute that the land has, is fun to know and use in your sort of landowner detective work.
All right. We're going to jump back. You mentioned Estes when we were talking a little bit about the idea with climate change. And John wants to know, if you establish an ESTA in your forest management plan, is it difficult to undo down the road? He says, several landowners that might be interested in ESTA, but wondered what happens if their plans need to change.
Yeah, I don't think that the determination, or it's my understanding that the determination that you have an ESTA on your property is something that ends up being like a permanent restriction. And so the plan could be amended. So you might have as an example, you might have ESTA that's referred to as a rich northern hardwood forest, which is actually something that is fairly uncommon on the landscape. In certain places in the state, it's more common, but it's typically in rich soils that are deep, that don't have a lot of water limitations, either excessively dry or excessively wet. And so it's a forest that has developed on the landscape, and that rich northern hardwood forest can be an ESTA, and it can also be a incredibly productive forest for boards and cords. And so it could be enrolled as an ESTA, described that way in the plan, and then a landowner might use a silvicultural guide that's for that forest type, which might be northern hardwood silvicultural guides, but find components of that silvicultural guide or the recommendations that exist in the scientific community to manage in accordance with certain parameters that would enhance or protect or allow the development of those qualities of a rich northern hardwood forest. And so that's one thing that it could be, that identifying the ESTA leads to harvesting to promote a new age class or a variety, add variety to the age class of the species composition as part of the management. And so it does depend. There might be other ESTAs that, if you have montane forest spruce fir or something, you own land at high elevations, then logging in them, first of all, might not be very productive economically, and it might have impacts that would be harder for that community to recover from. But certainly there's allowances if land's sold, transferred. ESTA can become, in the next plan update, just productive forest land.
Great, thanks for that. I'm gonna ask one last question as we're rounding on the 10 o'clock hour. Margie wants to know, they have a class 4 road that crosses their land, and there are sections that never dry out. There's always water, it doesn't flow, it just sort of sits there no matter how little rain is falling. Do you have any idea what's going on?
Yeah, it could be that, water runs downhill. And so it could be that, there's just no place for the water to run. And it could be that the road was put into place. Oftentimes roads are put in place historically where it was easy to go. And so between two little knobs or between two ledges, And so that's where the water ends up because it runs downhill. And so the wet spots, then the way to get rid of the water would be to either raise the roadbed by adding material, which would basically, again, water runs downhill. And so if you have a hole in the ground that's, 10 by 10, 10 feet by 10 feet, and it's a foot lower than the land around it in the middle, then that's where water's going to find itself. And depending upon the subsurface soils, that might stay there for a long time. But if you change the landscape locally there, you can drain that hole either by adding material to it or daylighting the hole so that the water will find its way out. And so again, I can help look at that sort of thing, but I would just, if I were a landowner with that sort of issue, I might go out with a roll of ribbon and mark, some portion of the areas that are most problematic or difficult to deal with. And then come up with a plan for those areas. And so do it maybe in a way that is, has some planned logic. Ultimately, if you need a piece of equipment, then you might want to do the whole thing rather than just those 5 problem areas.
Interesting. Yeah, I always love with water. Water, like you said, you started with water. It's kind of interesting to start and end with water a little bit because we were doing the training. Keith was out with us, and he said, it's so important. Water is such an important resource, but it also can, erode our trails. It can, cause problems like on roads. And so the idea is to slow, spread, and sink water. We want it in the ground. We want to keep it there. Our trees and our plants need it. So we want to slow it so it doesn't erode. We want to spread it so it gets more places and is slower so it doesn't erode. And we want to sink it. That's a great concept. Yeah. And then it can still get to the ocean.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting to know is that a 16-inch oak tree, a 16-inch diameter oak tree, on fully foliated on a hot summer July day, pumps between 200 and 300 gallons of water out of the ground and into our atmosphere every day through photosynthesis and transpiration. And so if you have a forest of 16-inch oak trees, or it could be maple or beech or whatever, I mean, the study that I read just used oak as the example, but so a 16-inch oak tree pumps approximately 300 gallons of water out of our soil and into our atmosphere through evapotranspiration every day. And that's a big number. If you start looking outside and imagining how many trees you have that size, it ends up there. It's like a factory. I mean, so they're moving water, adding wood, fixing carbon. They're awesome. Each leaf, each stomate, then each twig and branch, it's like an incredible thing.
Well, that sounds like a great place to end. Chris, thank you so much for being with us today. Again, my name is Lisa Sawswell of Vermont Coverts, and you can sign up for our e-news to be alerted to these and other programs. You can also hit the little donate button on the website. You can join Vermont Woodlands Association. You can also get to their e-news by signing up on their website. And we've loved spending the morning with all of you. We'll have Coffee with a County Forester again next Friday with Sam Shineski. So think of your questions, and we'd love to have you join us. Kathleen, would you like to add anything?
No, I just want to thank everybody for being here. It's really encouraging to see folks come in and join us on Friday mornings. Thank you, Chris. We've really enjoyed hosting these County Forester talks. And we'll work through our county foresters, and then we'll figure out what's next. Really
well, I'm glad to have been able to do this, and certainly if there are questions that we didn't get to that can get conveyed to me in some manner, I'd be happy to answer them in another way. I think I see a little chat box that has 38 notes, and so maybe I'll review that.
All right. Thank you all. Get outside and enjoy. Today's going to be a beautiful day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.